Good morning. I'm Andre de Mello Souza. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Applied Economic Research, which is a Brazilian think tank. This is a session on the G20 Takeaways, and we have two distinguished speakers, and I will shortly ask them to introduce themselves. Let me just also at the outset try to contextualize the discussions. The G20 has been recently and oftentimes pointed out as a major forum for international discussions, and not just in finance as it was originally, but in a host and a range of other issue areas, including climate change, inequality, health, and the like. The G20 is seen as this key forum nowadays, partly because it brings together the high-income economies, the ones that compose the so-called G7, as well as emerging economies, such as my own country and others of the developing world that have grown faster economically in recent years and also arguably need to be part of any major agreement on these issue areas. So we have here two representatives from these camps, or two speakers who will address these two sets of countries, and I will ask them to address what they consider are the major takeaways from the process this year during the Indian presidency and what they expect for the future. And so I will start with Gregory Simmons here to my right. Sir, the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself, and you can also address these questions before we pass on to our other speaker. Thank you.
Okay, my name's Greg Simons. I represent two parts of the world at different ends of the world. So originally from New Zealand, but living in Sweden, so different split perspectives. So yeah, I mean, G20, as you say, I mean, it's evolved a lot and quickly. And it represents this global north and global south. And so we've got different geopolitical and geoeconomic questions come out of this. And I think this is driven by this transforming global order, as they call it. And this, I mean, you're getting more consensus that there is a transforming global order, and what this transformation entails is this, at the moment, this relative decline of this US unipolar world, which is built around these Western-centric countries. And so what do I mean Western-centric? These kind of liberal Western-style democracies. So, I mean, we're talking about North America, EU, UK, and one can include Australasia, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore to a certain extent, although I'll explain why this is 50-50, it's transforming. But also you've got South Korea, Japan, these particular countries. And this global, and that's losing its absolute power. Absolute hegemony is gone. They've got a relative hegemony. And so when a hegemon begins to lose their power and others gain that power at their expense, there's always a fight back, or they accept it and go with the decline. And this time there is a fight back because you have these periods of history. And we've had that in the past where you've had these imperial configurations, and of course Latin America is no exception to this. So you have these constructions, Pax Romana, Peace of Rome, Pax Britannica, British peace, Pax Americana. But the problem with this is that this peace comes at the expense of other countries and their interests and their people. And so this is what is being challenged. And this is by what is being called this global south, or this non-Western centric multipolar order, which Brazil is part of within the context of BRICS. And you've got other, as being one of these, what would you say, competing non-Western institutions, which is rising And one can also mention Shanghai Cooperation Organization as another such non-Western centric institution, so this institution building. And this non-Western centric multipolar order includes, yes, as you say, these rising economies, a lot of which have been exploited historically. And we can see these changes pretty much on every continent, the results of this. So what this G20 has displayed, I think, are the tensions which rise from there. This attempt to hang on to this hegemony of this unipolar order as opposed to those who are challenging that hegemony. And, you've had these visible weaknesses in the US hegemony recently. I mean, Afghanistan was not their finest moment, which made the South Vietnam withdrawal look organised. And you can see now the next problem. And I think this is what G20 those parts of the G20, the Global South, understand, that now is a defining moment where countries either are a subject of international relations and events, or they're an object of international relations and events. And if you become an object during moments of transformation, it doesn't bode well for your country or for its people. So the choice needs to be made. I mean, you can see Sweden and Finland have opted for fighting for deck chairs on the Titanic. They're fighting to stay on board what is left of this unipolar order as it's relatively declining. But other countries are choosing to contest it. And so this is what we can see, these different events around the world, whether they're in Africa at the moment, or what is happening around Nigeria, or what is happening in Latin America with regards to different coups and attempted political warfare. But what has happened in Mexico, for instance, that you had a president elected who was not approved by the United States. In fact, he was contested quite strongly. But also you can see what's happening in Ukraine, which, I mean, it's not about Ukraine. This is more broadly about Europe. And what it has shown is who are the objects and who are the subjects of international relations, and the different miscalculations by both parts. And we can see here what this has done. It's demonstrated to those countries of the Global South, which the US has been trying to coerce into following what they want, while at the same time preaching national sovereignty and the choice of countries to make their own foreign policy choice, etc. For example, trying to bully India into trying to follow what they want. And this is an example. And so you've got things stemming from this, and I will start to wrap up so that get something to say. Well, it's creating not what the US anticipated. It's creating quite an opposite effect, and it's a strengthening one. Geopolitically, it's isolated. They call themselves the rules-based order, et cetera, et cetera. They do not adhere to international law. They are under extreme pressure to try and change things around. Ukraine was not a strategic interest for them. It's become one because of the rhetoric and the commitment to it. For the countries such as India, China, and others of the Global South, I mean, Brazil is absolutely no exception. Bolsonaro versus Lula, I mean, it's everywhere. So they understand this need to have their own autonomy, their own ability to influence events or to choose events in their interests. And you've got this de-dollarization, where this economic warfare aspect, this geo-economics part of geopolitics. And I mean, this is the thing which will, I think, ultimately put an end to the Western-centric hegemony. because this is the only thing that's been keeping it afloat. I mean, it's had these different political crises, military crises, economic crises. I mean, you've got the culture war component of this, but ultimately they've been able to finance this, and this is rapidly disappearing. And I give the floor.
Thank you for that, Mr. Simons. Indeed, we know both from history and from international relations theory that when we go through periods of power shifts or transitions, then international institutions become weakened and become more fragmented. And we have, as you described, a process of securitization, which permeates issues that are essentially economic in nature, trade, finance, but also other agendas, and that have to do with disputes between major powers, US and China, US and Russia, and others. So with that, I give the floor to Mr. Matej Gregorec. Please give us your take on the G20 and on these geopolitical tensions and challenges that are being posed to the G20. How can they be overcome, in your view?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andre. I'm Matej Gregorec. I come from the Slovenian Foreign Ministry. I organize an event called the Bled Strategic Forum, which is quite something similar to this. So I kind of have a both connection between the politics and the civil society. And I have to say I agree with most of the things that Gregory said. I mean, the world is changing, the world landscape is changing, the internal relations are changing. There is a move from this post-Cold War era unipolar world to a multipolar moment where we see great rivalry, great power rivalry between big nations again, especially in Asia, of course. You have China, the US. You have a rising India, which has a huge potential in terms of economy, in terms of anything else as well. And basically, my take on the G20 would be that what we've seen with the last G20, you can see India profiling itself as a rising power, trying to have a voice in the international relations, trying to be an influential actor. It's trying to do so, I mean, although you have diverging views inside of the group as well, which is of course normal. So for example, you have diverging views on Ukraine. Nevertheless, they managed to agree on a declaration which does not support gaining territory with the use of force and stuff like that. There was a very weak moment on climate issues and climate policy where there was very little agreement on what the G20 should be doing in this field. There was some agreement on the announcement of the transport and transit routes, basically the new routes from east to west. And of course, the African Union becoming a member. I mean, Africa is another potential, another big potential developing continent with many countries. And what we're basically seeing with the regional groupings, I would say, is that we're, despite diverging views, seeing a move from confrontation to cooperation. I mean, in the end, there are some topics, such as climate, finance, economy, which are the basis for the foundations of the world we live in, the workings of the world, and we'll simply have to agree on some of them.
Okay, thank you for that, and for bringing in a more optimistic view on the G20. So there's certain issues that we have to agree on. No country or no group of countries by themselves can address these issues. The so-called global public goods, you mentioned climate, health is another one, and certainly there are others. But again, the elephant in the room is that there is security concerns that permeate all the discussions, and they tend to trump these other issues, notwithstanding their importance for the future of mankind. So again, back to you, Mr. Simons. How do you think the G20 can help in getting these countries together? At least the major 20 members now, 21 members of the group. How can they act as a collectivity to address these challenges when there are security concerns that, again, that are very much present. And it doesn't hurt to remind you that the leader of China did not make it to the summit in India this year. As part of these tensions, it's not just the US and other major powers, there are also other internal tensions within the G20 itself. So again, back to you.
Okay, well, when you look at these things, I see, okay, you have G20, this big collection of different countries with different interests, different ways of thinking. But I see two broad approaches to how these groupings of countries deal with international relations, with foreign policy, these kinds of things. And I mean, it's basically broken down into those groups, global north and global south. And they're two different ways of seeing the world and two different ways of interacting with the world. And one of these, I would characterize that this Western-centric order, I mean, it's developed this rather messianic approach to the world, that it wants to spread this liberalism. It's become some kind of, well, religion, if you like, to convert others into your own image. And you've got all of these academic theories about global peace and all of these kinds of things which stem from that. Although it tends to ignore reality. So you've got a very ideological stance from the West, which is quite, I mean, it's quite ironic in a way, because if we look at the old Cold War, not this, what some would call the new Cold War, it was the West that was not ideological, and it was the Eastern Bloc that was ideological, and now you have this flip. And I think as part of that, I mean, this is causing problems in the West. I mean, if you look, for example, this idea of this Western-centric order, it's not at peace with itself. There are some parts which do not like this. Because, there's two parts to it on the international stage. One is the geopolitics, but then you've got this politics, this Western liberalism, which they're mutually supporting each other. One requires the other for this global hegemony. And you can see, for example, the idea of this messianic approach, and this was announced by even Fukuyama, this end of history. Everyone is going to be like us. And so you have these ideological projections. But they did not understand why the likes of Poland, Romania, Hungary, these eastern parts of the EU, why did they join the EU? It wasn't for Western liberal values. It wasn't for the political component. It was for the geopolitical component. It was to be a barrier, a sort of firewall against Russian influence. This was the main, because if we look at the two parts of the EU at the moment, as part of that, you have this Western liberalism, which has gone into this woke ideology, which has gone into this cancel culture, with these, which some call this cultural Marxism kind of notion, as opposed to the eastern part. You know, Poland, naughty boy, and Hungary are getting reprimanded. But, I mean, their identity and their culture is conservative, and these kinds of things do not jive with them as a cultural identity, etc. So that's one point. And that's within the Western-centric order. You take these woke values outside to India or these parts of the global south. I don't think they'd go too well in Brazil, some of these ideas either, presumably. But that's the one point. And what you have confronting it is this much more pragmatic one. They're not playing the zero-sum game of the US. Rather, they're playing a more balanced win-win. Of course, it can be a little bit lopsided one way or the other, but a much more pragmatic, based on national interests and things. So, I mean, you can have Turkey cooperating with Russia while at the same time they're fighting each other in proxy wars in Libya and in the South Caucasus. But the ideology doesn't trump, the pragmatism trumps. And one can see this with China and the Belt Road Initiative, that this is based on pragmatic rather than the solely ideological issues. So, I mean, you got these two worlds looking at the world differently. I think it's important to have the G20 conversations because my feeling from going to different Western conferences, whether they be academic or practical, because I've fought in both worlds, it's become an echo chamber. And you have these ones going on and everyone's preaching to the choir, and the choir is at a rather degenerated state at the moment. So you've got these filter bubbles and things like this. They need to be exposed to how other countries think, and G20 is one of those forums where the Global South can, face-to-face, express what they think on these issues. The question is, and the point is, for this to function, the West needs to get down from its high horse and actually listen to what is being said. Because if you're talking about communication, it's not only about talking, but it's about listening.
Thank you for bringing a view of the Global South, and not particularly an anti-Western view, but one that does try to acknowledge and recognize that there are other voices that should be heard that have a different interests and different view on these issues, which speaks to the North and South divide. That, ironically enough, though, has virtually disappeared from more recent agreements in the international agenda. And I would cite here the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. There's no North and South division or distinction, if you will, anywhere in the text of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. And Paris is another example, the Paris Agreements on climate change. There's also no such differentiation, whereas there used to be in previous international regimes and agreements. So that's one of the issues I'd like to raise. And the other one that you raised as well, which I think is quite relevant, is that pragmatism may mean that cooperation can proceed on a specific issue area basis. We can cooperate on climate even while we're fighting, and sometimes fighting literally, on other issue areas and on other spheres. And that also suggests that power may be exercised on an issue area basis. And maybe some countries are very powerful in the environmental area, as for instance my own, and not so much on security issues. So I would like to pose these issues here to our representative from Slovenia, and also ask you to close with your comments as you see fit, looking forward the issues that you consider more relevant. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think pragmatism itself is a good thing, right? So at least it's something that keeps the dialogue and the discussions, the talks, whatever, it keeps us going, no matter the differences that we might have between each other. It's very clear that the multilateral system is not working, that there are great divisions between the Global South, the Global North. There are historical grievances, which are natural. I would say that sometimes maybe even the Global South, which tries to break with the traditions that the Global North imposed on them, tries to kind of work in an opposite way. I think that doesn't work every single time. One such very good example of like the current situation in the world is the non-functioning United Nations system and its agencies and its organizations. We have a non-functioning Security Council, which of course is not okay. I mean, Slovenia, for example, is going to be presiding the UNSC in 2024. We've elected a non-permanent member just this year against Belarus. We were competing against Belarus, and until the very bitter end, we were actually not sure whether we will get the seat or not, because the UN itself is very split. Russia still exerts a huge influence in the General Assembly, on the African continent, in Asia, and we as Slovenia, we were seen as a part of the Western world. I mean, we are a part of the Western world. We are part of the UN, the NATO, the EU, of course. But like the global South basically sees us as a proxy of, I don't know, the US extension or the UK extension or whatever. And we will have to be working inside this chaotic situation in the UN and try to fix things, try to address things. But what we see fit is that we basically start talking about these things, that we also start talking about the UNSC reform, which of course is another very tough crack. And in today's world, there are players which demand to be heard. I mean, for example, it's not just India, it's also Africa. We will need a dialogue. We will need strategic decisions about the common good, the common interests, which are somewhat more important than the national interest or the regional interest themselves. And the main question is whether we are capable of this as the world. I mean, we have our differences, but we should also have our common points, as you discussed. Like COVID was one of such things. We had to cooperate on global health, which we basically almost never had to do on this scale before. We had the financial crisis, which basically was a consequence of the COVID shutdown and stuff like that. And right now, the situation doesn't look that good for us. We'll just have to keep on working harder and try to find common points to speak on.
Thank you for that, and thank you for raising the issue of the United Nations, which surprisingly enough, it hasn't come up thus far in our own discussions, even though it is the centerpiece of the international system. And I would agree, it is paralyzed largely because you put all the countries there. It's very hard to reach substantive agreements and to move forward. And I also agree with you, the Security Council needs to be reformed. But it's very difficult to do so because those who hold power do not share it or give it away very easily. But to the extent that it's not reformed, then it tends to become dysfunctional and lose relevance and legitimacy. But our time is up, so I would like to thank our two speakers for this very interesting and relevant discussion on the takeaways of the G20, and we'll stop here. Thank you very much.